I didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that stayed with Eliza Vane long after the door slammed in her face. Not the words themselves, but the way the rancher at Dunmore spread his hands flat on his desk, like she was a ledger entry. He was closing out and said, "I don't hire women with children. They're a distraction and a liability, and I've got enough of both already." Her daughter Clara was 6 years old and standing right there. She heard every word. Eliza took Clara's hand and walked back out into the Montana wind without saying a single thing in return, because she had learned by then, 3 ranches in, 11 days of walking, 2 pairs of shoes worn through at the heel, that some doors don't open no matter how hard you knock. You just find the next road and you keep moving. But standing on that dirt path with the Dunmore gate swinging shut behind her, watching her son Thomas up ahead with the handcart, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since her husband died. The specific hollow fear of a woman who has run out of options. If this had happened to you, if you had walked 11 days across open Montana country with 2 children and a cart that kept losing its left wheel, getting turned away at every door, with winter pressing down from the north like a boot heel, what would you do? What would you do when the last door closes? Before we follow Eliza down that road to the one place no one else would go, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because the stories we tell here are the kind that don't let you go, and you don't want to miss a single one. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories have traveled farther than any of us expected, and every time someone tells us where they're watching from, it reminds us why we keep telling them. Now, let's go back to the road. One. The handcart had a crack in the right axle that Thomas had wrapped with leather cord 3 times over the past week, and every morning Eliza woke up wondering if today was the day it finally gave out completely. She was 31 years old. She had $12.40 sewn into the lining of her coat, a half-empty sack of cornmeal, 2 blankets that smelled like wood smoke and wet wool, and 2 children who were doing a better job of not complaining than most grown men she'd known. That last part was both a comfort and an accusation. Children shouldn't have to be that brave. Not at 6 and 9. Not for any reason. Thomas pulled the cart because he decided at some point during the second day of walking that this was his job now, and he performed it with the grim focus of someone twice his age. He didn't talk much anymore. He used to talk constantly. Questions about everything, observations about birds and clouds, and the way certain rocks caught the light. Eliza missed that. She missed it the way you miss a sound you didn't realize you were relying on until the house went quiet. Clara was quieter by nature, but she watched everything. She had her father's eyes in that way, the kind that didn't miss much and didn't say what they saw right away. They had left Cedar Falls 6 weeks after Frank died, left the house they'd rented for 4 years, left the vegetable garden Eliza had coaxed into producing more than it should have, left the neighbors who had been kind enough in the beginning but had started looking at a widow with 2 children the way people look at a problem they're hoping someone else will solve. She hadn't blamed them. She understood it even then, the arithmetic of survival. People help when they can afford to. When they can't, they stop looking. Montana had come up because of a letter. A friend of Frank's, a man named Hutchins, had written to say there was work at the ranches north of Helena, that good workers were hard to find out there, that a woman who could cook and manage a household could find steady employment if she was willing to travel. The letter had been 6 months old by the time it reached her, forwarded twice, and Hutchins himself had moved on by the time she arrived. But the logic of it had seemed sound enough when she was still in Cedar Falls trying to figure out what came next. It had seemed less sound after the 4th ranch turned her away. It had seemed nearly impossible after the 7th. After Dunmore, standing on the road with Clara's small, cold hand in hers, and Thomas up ahead pretending not to have heard what the man said, Eliza stopped walking for a moment. Just a moment. She closed her eyes and pressed her free hand against her coat lining, feeling the slight resistance of the folded bills hidden there. $12. Maybe 3 weeks if she was careful. Maybe 4. She opened her eyes. Thomas had stopped the cart and turned around to look at her. He didn't say anything. He just waited. There was something in the way he stood, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, the same posture his father had when he was trying to hold something together, that made Eliza's chest tighten in a way she didn't have time for right now. "Keep going," she said. He turned back around and picked up the cart handles. But it was a woman at the trading post in a town called Birch Hollow, a heavy woman with gray-streaked hair and a look that suggested she'd seen most things twice, who mentioned Raven Creek Ranch almost as an afterthought. Eliza had stopped to ask about work, and the woman had gone through the usual list with practiced efficiency. The Caldwell spread was full up, the Hartley place wasn't hiring until spring, the Morrison brothers only took men. "There's Calder Hayes, I suppose," the woman said, already turning back to her shelves. "But nobody goes out there." "Why not?" The woman paused, set down the tin she was holding. "Because the man is impossible to work for, the ranch is half a step from collapse, and the last 2 people he hired quit inside a week. One of them said the chimney was going to kill someone before Christmas." She picked the tin back up. "The only thing he's asking for is a cook, just someone to make meals. But the state of that place?" She shook her head like she was dismissing a bad idea. "I wouldn't send anyone out there." Eliza thought about Dunmore, about the way the rancher had spread his hands flat on his desk. "How far is it?" she asked. Raven Creek Ranch was 4 miles north of Birch Hollow, along a trail that had been better maintained in some previous decade and had since been mostly forgotten. Eliza knew she was getting close, not because of any sign or landmark, but because the trail started looking more like the land around it. Overgrown at the edges, soft in the middle from poor drainage, the kind of road that tells you something about the people using it without saying a word. She smelled the smoke before she saw the buildings. Not good smoke. Not the clean, rising kind that tells you someone inside is warm and the wood is dry. This smoke was heavy and low, drifting sideways across the yard instead of pulling upward, spreading out along the ground like something trying to escape. She'd seen smoke move like that once before, in a house outside Cedar Falls where the chimney had been partially blocked by a bird's nest. The family inside had been getting headaches for weeks and couldn't figure out why. She filed it away, kept walking. The main cabin was solid enough in its bones. Good timber, decent construction, the kind of building that was built to last and had been allowed to fall behind on its upkeep. There was a water barrel on the south side with a crack running up from the base that someone had tried to patch with tar. The patch had failed. The ground around the barrel was darker than it should have been. There was a barn 40 yards back that looked like it was leaning 2 degrees more than it used to, and a hay storage area beside it where the cover had been repaired with wood that was lighter in color than the original, meaning it was newer, meaning the old cover had failed, meaning there was a real question about what that new cover was actually protecting. Eliza took all of this in between the gate and the cabin door. She knocked. There was a long silence, and then a voice from inside said, "It's not locked," in a tone that managed to convey both indifference and exhaustion at the same time. She pushed the door open. Well, Calder Hayes was sitting at a table that was covered in papers, maps, and what appeared to be several weeks of accumulated living. An empty coffee cup, a boot that needed resoling, a coil of rope that had no business being indoors. He was somewhere between 55 and 65, the kind of age that's hard to pin down on men who've spent decades outside, with gray in his beard and a hardness around his eyes that wasn't unfriendliness exactly, more like someone who had stopped making room for things that weren't useful. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Clara. He looked back at Eliza. "I advertised for a cook," he said, "not a family." "I know what you advertised for," Eliza said. "I can cook. My children won't be in your way." "How old are they?" 9 and 6. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the window and back. "What happened to your husband?" It was the kind of question that felt intrusive until you understood that out here it was practical. A widow with children was a different kind of risk than a married woman, different complications, different liabilities. She'd learned to answer it straight. "He died of a fever 8 months ago." Calder nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. "Can you cook a proper meal, or just survival food?" "Both," she said, "and I can do more than cook if it comes to that." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not softening, exactly, more like a door that had been closed all the way, opening the smallest fraction. "I don't need more than a cook," he said flatly. "All right," Eliza said. But she was already looking at the room around her, at the way the smoke from the fireplace was pulling in the wrong direction, at the dampness along the base of the north wall that someone had tried to cover with a piece of furniture that wasn't quite big enough, at the floorboard near the door that gave a particular sound when you stepped on it, not the normal creak of old wood, but the soft, uncertain give of wood that has lost its integrity underneath. She kept her face even. "What are you paying?" she asked. He named a number. It was modest but fair. She accepted it. He showed her where she and the children would sleep, a small room off the back of the cabin that was cold and smelled like disuse, and went back to his papers without further ceremony. Thomas set the handcart outside and came in without being asked and found a corner to put their things. Clara stood in the doorway of the small room for a moment, taking it in. "Is this home?" she asked quietly. Eliza looked at the crack in the ceiling plaster, the window with the broken latch, the single nail in the wall where someone had once hung something important. "For now," she said. She made dinner that first night from what was in the pantry. And the pantry was the first real revelation, because it was full. Not organized, not well managed, but full in the way that a pantry gets when someone has been buying supplies without a system, which meant there were things at the back that had been there so long they were no longer what they used to be. She found 3 sacks of cornmeal, 2 of which were fine, and 1 of which had gone soft in a way that meant moisture had gotten in. She found salt pork, dried beans, a quantity of hardtack, and 6 jars of preserved tomatoes that were still good. She found a tin of lard that was properly sealed and a smaller tin of coffee that was nearly empty. She moved things while she cooked, not dramatically. She wasn't trying to make a point. She just put like things together and moved what was good to the front and set aside what needed to be dealt with. Calder came in for dinner and sat down and ate without complimenting or criticizing the food, which she considered neutral. The stew was plain, but it was hot and there was enough of it, and the biscuits were right. Thomas ate like he hadn't eaten properly in days, which was more or less accurate. Clara ate carefully and watched Calder from the corner of her eye with the particular attention she gave to things she hadn't categorized yet. After dinner, Eliza stayed at the table and started going through the pantry more systematically. Calder had gone back to his papers. The fire was burning low. "The chimney," she said. He looked up. "The smoke is going the wrong way. You've got a blockage somewhere in the upper flue. It's been backing up into the room for a while, probably weeks. That's why the walls near the fireplace are darker than they should be. That's also—" She paused, choosing her words. "That's also probably why you've been having headaches." Silence. "I don't have headaches," he said. She looked at him. He looked away first. "I'll get someone to look at it," he said. "You don't need someone to look at it," she said. "I can fix it in the morning." He put his pen down. "You've fixed chimneys before." "My father was a builder," she said. "I grew up watching him. Then I watched my husband ignore things until they became problems. I'd rather not do that again." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough of it. Calder picked up his pen. "Do what you want," he said. "I hired you to cook." She didn't answer that. She went back to the pantry and kept working, and the fire burned lower, and somewhere out in the dark the wind had picked up and was pulling at the corners of the roof in a way that she didn't like at all. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Eliza sat on the edge of her narrow cot and looked at the wall and felt the full weight of where she was. This was not how she had imagined this. Not the room, not the ranch, not the hard-faced man with his papers and his indifference. She had imagined something more. Not comfortable. She'd never been foolish enough to imagine comfortable. But something with more promise visible in it. More of a beginning. This felt like someone else's ending. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. Outside, the wind continued its work on the roof. She could feel a thin current of cold air coming in from somewhere near the window. Another thing to address. The room had no insulation worth mentioning, and what was coming down from the north in the next few weeks was not going to be gentle. She knew what the woman at the trading post hadn't said directly, but had said with everything else. This ranch was dying. Not dramatically, not in a single crisis, but in the way that things die when nobody's watching carefully enough. One small failure at a time. What she hadn't said was who was going to stop it. Eliza lay down, pulled the blanket up, listened to her children breathe in the dark. In the morning, she told herself, she would fix the chimney, and then she would figure out what came next. The wind answered her from the north, and it sounded like a warning, and she filed that away too. She fixed the chimney before breakfast, not easily. It took her an hour and a half on the roof in wind that had teeth, using a length of chain she found in the barn and a rag stuffed into a tin can as a makeshift cleaning tool, and she came down with black dust on her face and hands and a scrape along her left forearm where she'd caught it on a loose shingle. But the blockage was cleared. Partially compacted soot and what appeared to be the remains of a bird's nest that had been there long enough to harden into something more like cement than organic material. She came back inside and rebuilt the fire. Within 20 minutes, the smoke was pulling straight up the way it was supposed to, rising clean and direct instead of curling back into the room. The difference in the air was immediate. She hadn't noticed how much the cabin had been holding on to that low, invisible accumulation until it was gone, a particular quality of thickness that you stop registering after a while because your body adjusts and you stop expecting the air to be better. Calder came in from the barn and stood in the doorway and looked at the fireplace for a long moment. "It's drawing right," he said finally. "Yes," she said, and set water on to boil. He sat down at his table and didn't say anything else about it. But he didn't argue either, and she counted that as something. Thomas had watched her from below the whole time she was on the roof, holding the base of the ladder with both hands, and the particular expression of a 9-year-old boy who is terrified but knows that saying so won't help anything. When she came down, he inspected the scrape on her arm without touching it. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "A little," she said, because lying to him had stopped working around the time Frank died, and he'd started paying attention to everything she said with the specific focus of someone checking for discrepancies. He nodded. "I can hold the ladder better next time." "You held it fine," she said. He didn't look convinced, but he picked up the chain she'd used and coiled it back the way he'd found it and carried it back to the barn, and that was Thomas. When there was nothing useful to say, he found something useful to do. The first week went like that. Small, necessary things. Eliza cooked 3 meals a day, plain food, honest food, the kind that doesn't require much commentary, and between meals she moved through the ranch with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory of a building they're about to buy. Not intrusively. She didn't touch things that weren't hers to touch or offer opinions that hadn't been asked for. But she looked. She looked at everything. The pantry reorganization took 3 mornings spread across the first week. She worked in the early hours before breakfast, when Calder was still outside doing his first round with the animals, and by the end of it she had identified and set aside 2 full sacks of spoiled cornmeal, a crock of lard that had gone rancid in a way that would have been unpleasant to discover mid-cooking, and a collection of glass jars along the back wall whose contents she couldn't identify with confidence because the labels had faded past reading. She replaced what she'd removed with careful arrangements of what was still good, grouped by type, with the older items in front. She told Calder about the spoiled cornmeal directly and without softening it, because in her experience men like him, men who had been running things alone for years, didn't respond well to being managed around. You told them the problem straight and let them decide what they thought about it. 2 full sacks, he said. Yes. The moisture got in from the back wall. There's a gap where the wall meets the floor on the north side. You can feel cold air coming through if you put your hand down. He looked at her. Then he looked at the north wall of the pantry like he was seeing it for the first time, even though he'd been storing food against it for years. "I'll seal it," he said. "I can do it," she said. "I said I'll seal it," he said, and there was enough edge in it that she let it go. He sealed it that afternoon, working alone and without asking her anything about where the gap was, which meant he'd gone and looked himself after breakfast. She noticed, but didn't mention it. The ranch hands were 3 men, a wide-shouldered man named Pete, who spoke in short sentences and did his work with the minimum amount of interaction with anyone, a younger man named Dill, who was 19 and talkative in the uncertain way of people who haven't yet figured out what they think about things and are trying to talk their way into an opinion, and an older hand named Gus, who had been at Raven Creek longer than either of the others, and had opinions about everything, including women doing work that he considered outside their appropriate territory. Gus made his feelings clear on the 3rd day, not to Eliza directly, but in the particular way men do when they want to be heard without being confronted about it, loudly, to Dill, within easy earshot of where Eliza was working. "Woman, fix the chimney," he said with a tone that made the statement into something between a joke and a complaint. "What's next? She gonna reshoe the horses?" Dill laughed, uncertain about whether it was funny. Eliza went on with what she was doing, which at that moment was identifying the source of a persistent smell near the barn's east wall that had been bothering her since the 2nd day. She crouched down and pressed her hand against the base of the wall where it met the ground, and felt what she'd suspected. The lower boards were soft. Not just damp, soft in the way that wood gets when it's been wet for a long time and the rot has worked its way through. She stood up and went inside to start lunch. She didn't say anything to Gus. Not that day, and not the next day when he made a comment about her reorganizing the pantry as though it was some kind of personal affront to the way things had been done before she arrived. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Gus was like trying to redirect a river with your hands. You could exhaust yourself doing it, and the river would still go where it wanted. The only thing that worked was changing the terrain. What changed Gus wasn't an argument, it was the biscuits. He'd been eating her cooking along with everyone else without comment, which she'd taken as either approval or indifference, and she hadn't pushed for anything more. But at the end of the second week, after a dinner of salt pork and beans and biscuits that had turned out particularly well, light in a way that biscuits in a camp kitchen don't usually manage to be, Gus picked one up off the plate and turned it over and looked at it like it had done something suspicious. Then he ate it. Then he ate two more. He still didn't compliment her cooking out loud, but the commentary stopped. Pete had never been a problem. He was the kind of man who assessed people by what they did and didn't have much use for assessing them by anything else. He'd watched her fix the chimney without comment and gone back to his work. And from that point on, he'd answered her questions about the ranch when she asked them, which she considered the closest thing to respect she was going to get in the first month. Dill was the most complicated of the three, in the way that young people are complicated. He wasn't hostile, but he was watching her the way the young watch new things, trying to figure out what category to put her in. He'd started helping Thomas with the handcart without being asked, and Clara had taken to following him around during the afternoon hours in the way that 6-year-olds attach themselves to people who don't immediately shoo them away, and Eliza watched this with the careful attention she gave to most things on this ranch. She didn't discourage it, but she kept watching. It was Pete who told her about the hay. Not directly. She'd asked him a question about the storage situation, and he'd answered it in that economical way of his, and the information had been in the answer if you were paying attention. He'd mentioned, without emphasis, that the last batch stored on the east side had come out damp at the bottom when they pulled it in early October. "How damp?" she asked. He held his thumb and forefinger about 2 inches apart. "That's not surface moisture," she said. "No," he agreed. "When's the bottom layer from?" "August," he said. "Maybe late July." She thought about that. Late July hay, still pulling moisture in October, stored under a cover that had been partially replaced earlier in the season. She went and looked at the hay storage that afternoon, really looked at it, getting down on her knees and pressing her palm flat against the base of the nearest bale, and then putting her nose close enough to smell it. The smell was the confirmation. It was faint, but it was there. The beginning of that particular warm sweetness that hay gets when it's composting from the inside. Not strong yet, not visible yet. But it was there, working its way up from the ground contact, and if the winter was anything like what the sign suggested it was going to be, the way the animals were eating, the thickness of the coat on the 2 older horses, the behavior of the birds at the tree line, they were going to have a serious problem by February. She thought about how to bring this to Calder. The chimney had been easy. It was an immediate danger, something that could be pointed to and demonstrated. The hay was different. The hay required her to explain not just what was wrong, but what was going to be wrong, and that meant asking him to trust her reading of a situation that hadn't fully declared itself yet. She'd been here 2 weeks. He'd been here years. She found him at the fence line on the north pasture's edge, doing repairs on a section that had taken wind damage. "I need to talk to you about the hay," she said. He kept working. "What about it?" "The east storage is composting at the base. It's not bad yet, but it's going to be bad. By February, you'll lose a significant portion of it. Maybe a third, maybe more depending on how cold it gets, and whether we get the moisture I think we're going to get." He stopped, turned to look at her. "You think you're going to get?" "The signs suggest—" "I've been reading signs on this land for 22 years, he said, and there was no anger in it exactly, just the flat statement of a man establishing a fact. "I know what this winter looks like." "Then you know it's going to be hard," she said. He said nothing. "The barn floor has moisture coming up from below," she said. "The drainage on the east side is running toward the building instead of away from it. Every time it rains, water is sitting against the base of those walls. The hay storage is directly adjacent. This didn't happen in one season. This has been building for years. But this year it's going to matter, Because this year the winter is going to be bad enough that you need every bale you have. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came through the fence posts. What would you do about it? He said. Not a question, quite. More like a test. Rebuild the floor of the hay storage with drainage underneath. Extend the drainage channel on the east side so it runs south instead of sitting against the wall. Move the current hay before it gets worse. Use the questionable bales first, this month, while the animals don't need as much, and protect the good bales for February. He turned back to the fence and worked a post back into alignment. That's a week's worth of work, he said. 2 weeks, probably, she said. But you've got time now. You won't have time in December. He didn't answer. She turned to go back. Eliza. She stopped. How do you know about drainage? She thought about how to answer that. About her father, about the years watching him build things and fail at things and rebuild them with what he'd learned. About Frank and the basement that had flooded for 3 straight springs because he'd refused to believe that soil had a slope until she'd made him pour a bucket of water along the foundation and watch it flow. I grew up paying attention, she said. She went back to start dinner. Behind her, she could hear him working the post, and then a pause, and then the sound of him walking in a different direction than he usually went at that hour, toward the hay storage. He didn't tell her she was right. He didn't come to dinner and announce that he'd inspected the hay and found what she described. What he did was come in that evening and sit down and eat, and then, after the meal, tell Pete, not Eliza, Pete, that he wanted the east drainage reworked starting Monday and the hay storage floor pulled up and relayed before the end of the month. Pete glanced at Eliza and back at Calder. Understood, Pete said. Eliza cleared the table. She understood what had just happened. It was the same thing that had happened with the chimney gap. He'd gone and confirmed what she told him himself, found it was accurate, and then acted on it in a way that allowed him to be the one making the decision. She didn't take it personally. The result was the same either way, and she didn't need the credit. She needed the hay to survive the winter. What she hadn't expected was Gus. He pulled her aside the following morning, the first time he'd sought her out directly for anything other than commentary, and said, without preamble, "The boss is going to work us hard on this drainage project." "I know," she said. "You know the ground is going to freeze in 3 weeks?" "I know." He looked at her like he was trying to calculate something. "You really think the winter's going to be that bad?" It wasn't quite a question. She answered it directly anyway. "I do," she said. He scratched the back of his neck, looked at the barn. "My last job, the winter of '88, we lost 11 head because the hay went bad and we didn't have the reserves. Took the ranch 3 years to recover." He said it without particular emotion, the way you report a fact that's been sitting in you long enough to lose its rawness. Nobody listens about hay until the animals start dying. "I know," she said again. He nodded slowly. "I'll work the drainage," he said. "I'll tell Dill to put his back into it." He walked away. She stood there for a moment and watched him go. The work on the drainage and hay storage took 9 days instead of 2 weeks, because Pete turned out to be the kind of man who did things right the first time, even when doing it right meant taking longer. And because Dill, once given a direct purpose and someone willing to show him how, worked harder than his age suggested he should be able to. Thomas helped where he could. He was 9 and the work was heavy, but he had his father's stubbornness when it came to being told he wasn't big enough for something. And Gus, in what Eliza suspected was not a completely accidental decision, assigned him to tasks that required more precision than strength. Measuring, marking, keeping materials organized and at hand. The boy was meticulous in a way that surprised even her. Clara shadowed Dill and was eventually put to work handing him tools when he needed them, an arrangement she treated with the gravity of a diplomatic appointment. Eliza watched all of this from the edges. She cooked, she looked, she thought. The ranch was beginning to make more sense to her the longer she was in it. Not the operations, those had been clear from the start, but the history embedded in the buildings and systems, the layer of decisions made by someone who had known this land well, and then the layer of decisions made after that person was gone. The repairs that were done carefully, and the repairs that were done quickly, and the repairs that weren't done at all, the progression of them telling a story as clearly as any document. She was looking at the chimney one afternoon, running her hand along the exterior stonework, checking the mortar for failures she might have missed, when she noticed a small gap between 2 stones at about shoulder height where a piece of mortar had fallen away completely. It wasn't structural. But in the space where the mortar had been, tucked back against the inner stone, was the corner of something. She pulled at it carefully. It was a small book, leather-bound, thin, the kind people used for personal records rather than serious journals. The leather was stiff from years between stones, but when she opened it, the pages were intact, small, close handwriting in dark ink, covering every available surface with the kind of thoroughness that suggested someone who was afraid of running out of space. She looked at the first page. There was a name written at the top in larger letters, Margaret Hayes, her record, Raven Creek Ranch, beginning March 1879. Eliza stood very still for a moment. The wind moved across the yard. She looked at the book in her hands, and then at the house, and then back at the book. She understood immediately that this was not hers to read. She also understood that whatever was in it might be exactly the kind of knowledge she was working without. She took it inside and set it on the table and went back to the chimney and finished what she was doing and started dinner, and let the book sit where she'd left it. And when Calder came in for the meal, she pointed to it without explanation and said, "I found that in the chimney wall. I didn't read it." He looked at the book for a long time before he picked it up. She went back to the stove and didn't look at him. She heard him open it, heard the silence that followed. "Margaret," he said, quietly, more to himself than to her. She said nothing. He sat down with it at his table and didn't come to dinner until it had been sitting on the stove long enough to go cold, and she reheated it without comment and set it in front of him, and he ate it without seeming to taste it. And that night she heard him in the main room long after the children were asleep and the fire had burned down to coals. She didn't know what the book said, but in the morning, when she came out before dawn to start the fire, the book was on the table with a piece of paper laid on top of it, folded once. She didn't touch it. But later that morning, when she went to get water and the table was briefly unoccupied, she saw that the paper had shifted, had been picked back up, and then set down again. And from where she stood, she could see that it was a page from the journal, a page Calder had copied out in his own handwriting. The words she could read, at the angle she was standing, were a list. Dates and weather observations. Notes about which pasture drainage had failed in which year and what the conditions had been before it happened. Notes about the hay storage and moisture and what months the problems had declared themselves. Margaret Hayes had been watching this ranch the same way Eliza had been watching it. She'd just had 20 years to do it in. Calder gave her the book 3 days later. Not formally. He left it on the kitchen table one morning when she came in to start breakfast, placed where she couldn't miss it, and when she picked it up and looked at him, he was already moving toward the door. "It's records," he said, "of the ranch. She kept records of everything." He had his coat on and his hand on the doorframe. "Some of it might be useful." He went outside. Eliza sat down at the table with her coffee going cold beside her and opened Margaret Hayes's record and read it straight through to the end before the children woke up. And what she found there was not sentimental and not elaborate. It was a woman who had understood land in the same intuitive way that Eliza understood it, who had been watching and noting and drawing conclusions for the entirety of her life at Raven Creek Ranch, and who had left behind a document that was as close to a manual for this specific piece of earth as anything Eliza had ever encountered. The drainage patterns, the wind behavior in different seasons, and what it meant for which structures were vulnerable, the years when the creek ran high and what that did to the east pasture, the relationship between early snowfall on the far ridge and the severity of what followed in January and February. Notes about the animals, which ones had been the hardest to winter, what she'd fed them, and what she'd changed, what had worked and what hadn't. Eliza read all of it twice. She started making notes in the margins of her own, in pencil, next to Margaret's observations, her own readings of the same patterns over the past 3 weeks, confirming some, adding to others, finding 3 or 4 places where what she'd observed this season matched what Margaret had described in the bad years, and not the moderate ones. When she looked up, Claire was standing in the doorway to the back room watching her. "What are you reading?" Claire asked. "A record," Eliza said. "Whose?" Eliza thought about how to explain it. "Someone who used to live here," she said. "Someone who paid attention." Claire considered that. "Like you do?" Eliza looked at her daughter for a moment. The question was simple and direct and more accurate than Clara probably knew. "Something like that," she said. What Eliza understood by the end of October, The full picture assembled from Margaret's records and her own 3 weeks of observation and the information she'd collected from Pete and Gus and the patterns she'd been tracking since she arrived, was that Raven Creek Ranch was not simply behind on its maintenance. It was behind in ways that had been compounding quietly for years, each problem making the next one slightly easier to arrive and slightly harder to address. The chimney had been bad for at least 2 winters, which meant 2 winters of the house slowly accumulating what the smoke brought back into the room. The drainage problem on the east side was older than that. Margaret had flagged it as a risk in her final year of records, which was 1884, which meant it had been worsening for over a decade. The hay storage floor issue was the direct consequence of the drainage issue, which was the consequence of a grading decision made when the barn was extended, which had seemed fine when it was dry. None of these things had killed the ranch, but they were the reasons the ranch looked the way it did. They were the reasons Calder Hayes' shoulders had that particular set to them, the way a man carries weight he's stopped expecting to put down. She went to him on a cold Tuesday with a list written out on the back of a flour sack, practical in order of urgency, and laid it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. "That's months of work," he said. "Some of it is," she said. "Some of it is one afternoon. I've marked which is which." He ran his finger down the page, stopped at one entry. "You think the north fence line is failing? Third post from the eastern gate is loose at the base. Gus confirmed it last week. I checked the adjacent posts and 2 more are soft. That section was probably done all at once, which means they're aging together." He was quiet. "Calder," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name directly, and she noticed it land, saw the slight shift in his attention. "The ranch is fixable. It's not gone, but the window is getting shorter." He looked at the list for another moment, and then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told something he already knew by someone he's still deciding whether to trust. "Why do you care?" he said. "You're a cook. You said so yourself." "I said you hired me to cook," she said. "That's different." He didn't answer. She went back to the kitchen. But outside, the wind had shifted, coming from the northwest now instead of the north, and when she put her hand against the cabin wall, she could feel the temperature in the timber itself had dropped 3 or 4 degrees since morning. She looked at the ridge where Margaret's records said the snow came from first. The upper quarter was already white. It had not been white that morning. She thought about February, she thought about the hay, she thought about the list she'd handed Calder and how many of the items on it they could realistically get to before the first real storm arrived, and the math of it was not comfortable. She went back inside and started on the bread, and did not let herself think about what she couldn't control, only about what she could. Across the yard, through the window, she could see Calder still sitting at the table with her list in front of him, his hand flat on the paper the same way she'd seen him sit with his maps, the same way he sat with problems he was working through. He hadn't put it aside. I was still reading it. She turned back to the bread and worked the dough, and outside the temperature kept falling, and the ridge above Raven Creek held its new coat of snow and didn't let it go. The snow on the upper ridge held for 4 days, and then it snowed again, and this time it came down to the tree line, and Eliza watched it from the kitchen window while the bread cooled on the rack and thought about the list she'd given Calder and how many items were still undone. They'd gotten through most of the urgent ones. The drainage on the east side was reworked and running the right direction. The hay storage floor had been pulled up and relaid with gravel underneath for drainage, and the questionable bales had been moved to the front of the rotation and were being fed out first. The north fence section had been reposted. Pete had done it in a single long day, working in weather that had no business being worked in, and come in at dark with his hands so cold he'd had trouble unbuttoning his coat. The chimney was clean. The water barrel's cracked patch had been replaced with something that would actually hold. What remained on the list were the things that would take more time or more materials than they currently had. The cabin's north wall needed proper insulation work, not just the gap ceiling Calder had done in October. The barn's west side had a roof section that moved in high wind in a way that suggested the fastening underneath had failed. And there was the matter of the creek bank on the north pasture edge, where erosion had been quietly narrowing the usable ground for years, and would continue doing so regardless of winter. Those things were going to have to wait. What Eliza had not put on the list, because she didn't know how to quantify it or address it practically, was Calder's leg. She'd noticed the limp in her first week. Not a dramatic limp, not the kind that announced itself. More the kind that a man develops strategies to minimize, A slight adjustment in how he distributed his weight when he thought no one was watching. A preference for stationary work over walking work when he had the option. A way of coming downstairs in the morning that was slower than it should have been for a man his size and general physical condition. She hadn't asked. He hadn't offered. But she'd watched it worsen through October as the temperature dropped, and by the first week of November it was a different thing than it had been when she arrived. Less compensated, less concealed. Some mornings he came out of his room holding the doorframe for a moment before he committed his weight to the floor, and if she happened to be at the stove when that happened, she gave the pot in front of her complete attention, and did not look up. She asked Pete about it on a Tuesday while they were both working near the barn. Just directly, because she'd found that direct questions got her further with Pete than any other approach. "His leg," she said. "What happened?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "Horse came down on it," he said. 5-6 years ago. Bone didn't set right the first time. Had to be broken again and reset. He picked up what he was carrying and adjusted it. Cold makes it bad. How bad does it get? Pete looked at her. Bad enough that in the winter of '91 he didn't leave the cabin for 2 weeks. He moved off toward the barn. Eliza stood where she was for a moment, reorganizing several things in her understanding of Raven Creek Ranch and what the coming winter actually meant. A man who could be effectively immobilized by cold. A storm season that Margaret's records and the current signs both suggested was going to be the worst in several years. A ranch that had spent the last decade building up a quiet accumulation of structural vulnerabilities, most of which they'd only just begun to address. She went back to the kitchen and looked at the ridge and did the math again. The math still wasn't comfortable. Brock Talley came to the ranch for the first time on a gray Thursday in early November, riding in on a horse that was better than the man deserved, in Eliza's private assessment. He was a broad man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the look of someone who had been reasonably successful and had decided that this success was primarily evidence of his own quality rather than circumstance. He ran the spread 2 miles east of Raven Creek and had apparently been Calder's neighbor for going on 8 years. He tied his horse at the post and came to the cabin door, and Calder let him in, and Eliza poured coffee and went back to what she was doing, which was mending a split in Thomas's coat that had been getting worse for a week. The two men talked ranch business for a while, pasture-sharing arrangements for the spring, some matter about a boundary marker that had been disputed since the previous summer. Eliza listened without appearing to, the way she'd learned to listen in rooms where men talked around women and assumed the women weren't tracking. Then Brock said, "I heard you hired a cook." There was a quality to the way he said it, the slight emphasis on cook, the tone that was just barely the wrong side of neutral, that made Eliza set her mending down. "I did," Calder said. "Woman, I heard." "That's right." Brief silence. Eliza could hear Brock moving his coffee cup on the table. "You know, Calder, there are men available who could do the cooking and some of the other work, too. More practical arrangement for a ranch like this." "I've got men," Calder said. "I mean someone who could be useful in other ways, all around hand." Another pause. "Having a woman around, especially with children, it complicates things." "It hasn't complicated anything," Calder said. Brock made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. "She been trying to tell you how to run the place? I heard she was up on the roof with tools. I heard she's been reorganizing things." "You heard a lot," Calder said. "People talk. Town's not that big." A chair moved. "I'm just saying, Calder, there's a certain order to things out here. A ranch is not—" He seemed to be searching for the right framing. "A ranch is a hard operation. It doesn't run on good intentions." "No," Calder said. "It runs on work." Eliza picked up her mending and kept her eyes on the coat sleeve and her face arranged into something that did not indicate she was listening to every word. She heard Brock make another non-committal sound. The sound of a man who has said his piece and is choosing not to push further in this particular moment. She heard the men finish their coffee. She heard Brock stand and say goodbye and Calder see him to the door. When Calder came back in, he didn't say anything. He sat down at his table and picked up his pen. Eliza bit her thread and smoothed the mended seam and thought about order. About the kind of order that put women in certain rooms and kept them there, and about the entirely different kind of order that made a ranch survive a winter. "He's not entirely wrong," she said, to her surprise as much as anything. Calder looked up. "About it being complicated," she said. "I know what I look like here. I know what people are saying in town. People in town can manage their own ranches, Calder said, and went back to his papers. She went back to the coat. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't comfort, but it was Calder Hayes, and she was beginning to understand that from him, it was close enough to both. The first serious snow came on a Friday night, 3 weeks into November, and it was not the worst. Not yet. But it was enough. 8 inches by morning, the temperature having dropped somewhere in the night past the point where the moisture in the air crystallized before it hit the ground and came down in the fine, dense kind of flakes that pack hard and don't blow loose again. The kind of snow that doesn't look dramatic from inside, but changes the shape of everything it touches. Eliza had been awake since before the snow started. She'd felt the shift in the air the previous afternoon, a drop that wasn't just temperature but pressure, the particular kind of stillness that Montana air develops before weather moves in with intention. And she'd spent the evening doing the things she could do before it arrived, filling every available container with water, because freezing pipes were a real possibility now, and she didn't want to find out. At breakfast that the hand pump had locked, moving the split wood from the lean-to to the porch, under cover, where it wouldn't absorb snow, checking that the latch on the barn's main door was fully set. Calder had watched her doing these things without comment, which by now she recognized as something close to approval. The animals came through the first snow fine. The hay storage held dry. The drainage channels they'd rebuilt in October ran melt away from the barn foundation the way they were supposed to instead of sitting against it, and Eliza stood in the barn doorway that first morning and watched the melt run south and felt something that was neither pride exactly nor relief exactly, but a combination of both with exhaustion added in. Pete came up beside her. "East Channel's working," he said. "Yes," she said. Gus thought it would back up at the elbow. "I know, I heard him say so." Pete was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't say it, but he knows he was wrong about the hay. He doesn't need to say it," Eliza said. Pete looked at her sideways. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." December came, and the cold that came with it was different from November's cold. November had been the cold of preparation, the cold that reminded you to check your work. December was the cold that evaluated it. Every decision made in October and November was tested in December by temperatures that fell hard at night and didn't climb back far enough in the day, by wind that found any gap in any wall with the patience of something that had all the time it needed. The cabin held. Not perfectly. Nothing held perfectly. There was a morning in the second week of December when the north wall was cold enough to feel through the plaster from 2 feet away, and Eliza got up before dawn and stuffed additional rags into every gap she could find and hung an extra blanket as a barrier, which was inelegant but effective. There was a day when the hand pump froze for 3 hours despite her precautions, and Thomas spent the morning bringing water from the barn trough in a bucket, with the focused expression of someone committed to a task, regardless of its unpleasantness. There was a night when the wind hit the west side of the cabin with enough force to rattle the window in its frame, and Clara woke up and came to find Eliza, and Eliza held her in the dark and listened to the wind do its work and felt the cabin hold against it, timber by timber. It held. What she hadn't anticipated was the calf. One of the 3 cows, a broad, brindle-colored animal, the hands called Martha, with the unsentimental pragmatism of ranch naming, had been showing signs for 2 weeks that her pregnancy was not following the schedule everyone had assumed. She was due in late January at the earliest, which was already an inconvenient time, but by mid-December she was showing the kind of restlessness that meant things were moving faster than intended. Eliza had noticed it first, had mentioned it to Pete, who had agreed that Martha was behaving oddly, had mentioned it to Calder, who had looked at the cow with the expression of a man adding one more problem to a list that was already longer than he liked. "If she goes early," Calder said, "it'll be rough." "I know," Eliza said. "You know anything about calving?" She thought about what she knew. She'd seen it done twice, both times in less difficult circumstances than this. She knew the general shape of it. She knew what could go wrong. "Some," she said. "Not as much as I'd like." "Gus has done it," Calder said. "I've done it. Pete has." "All right," she said, but the way he'd said it wasn't dismissive. It was more like he was taking inventory. What came instead, before the calving and before the worst of the winter, and before any of the things Eliza had been bracing for, was the storm on the 14th of December. She felt it coming 2 days before it arrived. The animals felt it before she did. The horses were drinking more and moving less, standing closer to the barn walls than they usually stood, with the particular inward quality that horses develop when something in the air tells them to conserve. The birds at the tree line disappeared on the morning of the 13th. Not fewer of them. None of them. She told Calder at breakfast. He set his coffee down and looked at the window. "How long do we have?" he said. "A day," she said. "Maybe less." He stood up. "Pete," he said, to the room in general, though Pete hadn't come in yet. Then he raised his voice. "Pete." Pete appeared in the doorway. "Get everyone," Calder said. "We've got work to do." They spent that day doing everything at once. Calder moved through the ranch on his bad leg with an intensity that Eliza suspected he would pay for in the next few days, pushing through what the cold was doing to the joint with a focused refusal she recognized as the kind of determination that has a cost that gets collected later. He directed the men, coordinating the securing of everything that could be secured, the stockpiling of wood and water, and feed in the places where it would be needed if movement across the yard became difficult. Eliza cooked constantly through the day, big batches of things that would keep and could be reheated, filling every container she could find. She sent Thomas and Clara on specific tasks, Thomas keeping the wood box filled and the water buckets topped off, Clara sorting and organizing the indoor supplies with the methodical precision she brought to everything. They both knew this was serious. Neither of them said so. Dill asked her mid-afternoon while carrying a load of wood through the kitchen, "How bad do you think it's going to be?" She thought about the birds, about the horses, about what Margaret Hayes's record said about the storms that came off the northwest ridge, when the temperature had been doing what it had been doing. "Bad enough," she said. He nodded and went back out. The storm arrived that night. Not gradually. It came in between 9 and 10 in the evening with the particular abruptness of the worst kind of weather, the kind that doesn't build up to itself but simply arrives. The wind hit the cabin like something with intent, and the temperature outside dropped 15 degrees in the first hour. By midnight, the snow was coming horizontally. Eliza sat up by the fire. She wasn't sleeping. She'd known she wasn't going to sleep, and she didn't try. She listened to the storm do its systematic work on the ranch and thought about the hay dry in its storage, and the water containers full, and the animals in the barn, and the fence line repaired, and the drainage running south instead of sitting against the east wall, and she did what she always did when she'd done everything she could do. She let it be enough. Calder was not sleeping either. She could hear him in the main room, the occasional sound of his chair, the low feed of the fire. At around 2 in the morning, she came out and put more wood on the fire without asking whether he wanted it, and he didn't say anything, and she sat down in the other chair, and they both listened to the storm. "The chimney's drawing right," he said eventually. "Yes," she said. "Margaret always knew when the big ones were coming," he said. Not to Eliza quite, more to the room. She'd get quiet a day or two before. I used to think it was just her way of being worried, but it wasn't. She was listening to something. Eliza didn't respond. The fire worked between them. "She was the one who first noticed the drainage problem," he said. "Wrote it down. I read it in her records after she was gone, and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought I'd get to it." "You've been doing the work of 2 people," Eliza said. "No," he said quietly. "I've been doing half the work of 2 people and calling it enough." He shifted in his chair. His leg was clearly hurting. She could see it in the way he held himself, the slight brace of it. She would have had this fixed in the first year. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the north wall. The fire answered it. "The ranch is still here," Eliza said. I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." They sat there until the fire needed wood again, and Eliza put more on, and eventually Calder fell asleep in his chair, and she went back to the small room and lay on her cot and listened to the storm and felt the cabin hold. In the morning, the world was white in every direction, and the wind had not stopped. The barn was inaccessible in any practical sense. Getting to it meant crossing 40 feet of open yard in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. The snow chest-high in the drifts that had built overnight against any structure that gave the wind something to push against. Calder assessed the yard from the cabin door, and his leg gave him away. She saw it in the way he stood, the weight distribution that was wrong, the particular stillness of a man who is calculating whether he can do what needs to be done. He couldn't. Not today. Not with the leg like that. He knew it. He turned from the door and his face had that expression, the one she'd started to recognize, the anger of a capable man confronted with his own limitation. "I need to check the animals," he said. "I'll go," Eliza said. "You'll—" He stopped. "Tell me what to check," she said. "Tell me what I'm looking for." "The storm will push you over." "It won't," she said, though she wasn't certain of this. "There's rope in the lean-to?" "On the left side, coiled on the second hook. Then I tie myself to the porch post and to the barn door, and I walk between them." She was already getting her coat. "The rope is long enough?" A pause. "Yes." "Tell me what I'm looking for," she said again. He told her. She listened and repeated it back, and he corrected one thing, and she put it in her memory, and she went out. The cold was a different category of cold than she'd experienced. Not just temperature, but force. The wind drove the cold into clothing, into skin, into the place behind your eyes where cold eventually reaches when it's serious enough. She found the rope on the second hook exactly where he'd said, and she tied one end to the porch post with a knot her father had shown her when she was 8 years old, for reasons that had nothing to do with Montana winters. And she walked the rope out across the yard, paying it out behind her, leaning into the wind with her whole body. The barn door was on the lee side, which was the one small mercy. The drift had built up against the north face, not the south, and the door was reachable if you came around to it. She tied the other end of the rope to the door's cross brace and pulled it open and went in. The animals were frightened and cold and alive. She went through them the way Calder had described, checking each one, looking at the things he'd told her to look at, running her hands over the animals in the specific places he'd specified, and finding what she found. The horses were stressed but sound. The cattle were huddled together at the back, which was instinct and served them well. Martha, the pregnant cow, was standing apart from the others, and Eliza stopped when she saw her. The cow was in labor. Not in the beginning stages. Well into it. She had that look, the particular inward intensity of an animal in the serious part of the process, the cycle of effort and pause that meant the calf was moving. The timing was wrong by 6 weeks at minimum, and 6 weeks early in December in conditions like these was a different kind of problem than 6 weeks early in the spring. Eliza stood in the cold barn and assessed what she was looking at, and what she had, and what she knew. Then she went back to the cabin. She came through the door fighting the wind, and Calder was at the table with his legs stretched out at the angle that meant the joint was bad. And he looked at her face and said, "What is it?" "Martha's in labor," she said. He started to stand. "Sit down," she said. "Your leg is not going to carry you across that yard, and it's not going to help you inside the barn if you get there." She was taking her coat back off and hanging it up, and her hands were red from the cold and not yet working properly. "Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. "Have you ever—" "Twice," she said, "both times with experienced people present. Tell me what to do and I'll do it." He told her. She went back out. What happened in the barn over the next 3 hours was not orderly and was not clean and was not the kind of thing that has a clean narrative shape to it. It was a frightened animal and a cold barn and hands that kept losing feeling and the need to restore it enough to work, and the specific focused terror of doing something important in conditions that make doing anything correctly very difficult. Gus arrived 40 minutes after she started, having made it from the bunkhouse by following the fence line with his hands. He came into the barn and took in the situation and didn't say a word about Eliza being there or about whether she should or shouldn't be. He just moved to where she was and looked at where things stood and said, "You've got the positioning right. Hold that." She held that. He did the parts that required strength and experience she didn't have. She did the parts that required patience and steady hands and the willingness to stay in one position past the point of comfort. Thomas appeared at some point. She didn't know how he'd gotten across the yard, would address that later, and was given the job of keeping the lantern steady and did it without flinching. The calf came at 11 in the morning into Eliza's hands, not breathing. She'd been told by Calder what to do if this happened. She did it. It wasn't delicate. It wasn't what she would have chosen. But she did what he'd described and Gus did the other part simultaneously. And 30 seconds that felt like 10 minutes passed in that barn, in the storm, with everyone holding still. The calf took a breath, a small one, uncertain, and then another. Gus made a sound that was not a word. Thomas, behind the lantern, let out the breath he'd been holding for probably the last 2 minutes. The calf was on its feet in another hour. Unsteady, wrong-looking, too small and too early for the world it had arrived in, but breathing. Martha was exhausted and wary, and eventually, after enough time, began doing what she was supposed to do. Eliza sat on the barn floor in the straw and looked at the calf and felt the particular emptiness that comes after sustained crisis. Not relief, not yet, just the absence of the tension that had been holding everything in place for the last 3 hours. Gus sat down a few feet away. He was breathing hard. His hands were shaking, though she suspected he would deny it if she mentioned it. "That cow," he said, after a while, "has terrible timing." "The worst," Eliza agreed. He looked at the calf. "You kept your head," he said. Not effusive, just a statement, the way he stated most things. "I didn't have another option," she said. "People always have another option," he said. "They don't always pick the right one." Outside, the storm continued. The wind was doing something complicated and loud to the roof of the barn, and the temperature wasn't rising, and the 40 feet between the barn door and the cabin was still an event that required planning. But the hay was dry in its storage, properly stacked and covered. The drainage was running south. The chimney at the cabin was drawing clean and straight, warming a house with solid walls and a sealed north corner and wood stacked on the porch under cover. And in the barn, in the straw, a calf born 6 weeks too early into the worst storm of the season was breathing. Eliza put her hand on the barn floor and pushed herself to her feet. Thomas was asleep against the wall with the lantern beside him, having done his job until his body made the decision for him. She looked at him for a moment. 9 years old and asleep in a barn floor in a blizzard, the lantern still upright where he'd set it, and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. "Can you get back to the bunkhouse on the fence line?" she asked Gus. "I can," he said. "Then go," she said. "I'll stay with the animals." He looked at her, looked at Thomas, looked at the calf. "I'll be back in 2 hours," he said. "All right," she said. He went. She sat back down in the straw next to her sleeping son and pulled her coat tight and kept watch over a barn full of animals that were alive because of work done in October, and rope found on the second hook, and hands that kept losing feeling and finding it again, and she waited for the storm to show her what it had left. The storm broke on the 3rd day. Not gently. There was nothing gentle about the way that storm ended. It simply stopped, the way a fist unclenches, and what it left behind was a silence so complete that Eliza stood in the cabin doorway that morning and felt the quiet pressing against her ears like something physical. The sky had gone the particular pale blue that comes after serious weather, a color that meant cold and clarity and no more snow for at least a few days. The yard was unrecognizable. Drifts had reshaped everything. The fence posts had become suggestions, the path to the barn had ceased to exist, the lean-to was buried to its roofline on the north side. The world that the storm had arrived into was gone, and this new white world had replaced it. Eliza stood in the doorway for a long moment and took stock. The chimney smoke rose straight up, clean and direct, pulling hard in the cold, still air. She watched it for a few seconds and felt something settle in her chest that had been braced for 3 days. Inside, the water containers were still full. The wood on the porch was down to 1/3 of what she'd stacked, but there was more in the lean-to if someone dug for it. The children had slept through the night for the first time since the storm started. Calder's leg had gotten worse over the 3 days, as she'd expected it would. He'd been managing it with the kind of deliberate stoicism that men of his generation applied to most forms of pain, which is to say, he'd been pretending it wasn't happening until it became impossible to pretend. And by the 2nd day, he'd been moving between his chair and his cot, and very little else. She'd brought him his meals without commentary. She'd done what needed doing without asking permission for any of it. And he'd let her, which was its own kind of thing. A man who'd been running this ranch alone for years, stepping back from the center of it, not because he wanted to, but because the situation required it, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that. She'd found that honesty in him early. It was one of the things she'd filed away. The calf had survived the storm. Gus had been back and forth to the barn through all 3 days, making the crossing on the fence line with the patience of a man who'd done difficult things long enough that difficulty had become just another condition of work. The calf was small and uncertain on its feet, but it was drinking, and it was warm, and Martha had settled into her role with the practical efficiency of an animal who doesn't have opinions about inconvenient timing. Eliza went back inside and started breakfast. She heard Calder come out of his room, the particular sound of his morning movement, the pause at the doorframe, and she put his coffee on the table without looking up. "Storm's done," she said. "I know," he said. "I can feel it." He meant the leg. The cold weather pain had its own barometric quality. She understood that from Margaret's records, which had mentioned it in practical terms in the entry for the winter of 1882. Calder's leg improves when the pressure rises. Worth noting for planning purposes. Margaret Hayes had been a woman who thought in terms of planning purposes. He lowered himself into his chair with the careful movement he'd been using for 3 days and wrapped his hands around the coffee and looked at the window. "I need to get out there," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "And not alone." He looked at her. "The yard is drifted over the fence in 3 places," she said. "I walked the porch rail this morning to check. If you go down in a drift with that leg, you're not getting up without help, and Pete and Gus won't know where to look." A silence. The fire worked in the hearth. Outside, that pale blue silence continued. "After breakfast," he said. Not agreement exactly, but not argument either. The work of the days after the storm was the slow, physical labor of digging out. There was no drama in it, just the steady, exhausting process of moving snow from places it couldn't stay to places it didn't matter, of checking every structure and every animal and every system that the storm had spent 3 days testing, of adding up what held and what didn't. Most things held. The barn roof section on the west side that Eliza had flagged and not gotten to, the one with the failed fastening underneath, had shifted during the second night of the storm. Not collapsed, not failed completely, but moved enough that daylight was visible along one edge, and the gap would need to be addressed before the next serious weather. Pete looked at it the morning after the storm and gave it the expression of a man calculating time and materials and available bodies, and then went and got his tools without saying anything unnecessary. 2 fence sections on the north pasture edge had gone down under the drift weight. Not the section they'd reposted in October, which held fine, but an older section to the west that hadn't been on Eliza's list because there was only so much list you could work through before winter. The cattle had stayed in the barn and hadn't tested the fence during the storm, so nothing had gotten out, but it needed to be repaired before the ground thawed enough to make reposting complicated. The cabin's north wall had done what she'd expected. The insulation measures she'd taken before the storm had been adequate but not comfortable, and she spent 2 days after the storm doing the proper work on it that she hadn't had time for before, working from inside with Dill passing her materials and holding sections in place while she fitted them. It wasn't finished work. It wasn't what she'd have done if she'd had the time and the right materials, but it was better than it had been, and better was what the situation allowed. Calder watched her work the north wall from his chair, his legs stretched out, a quality of attention on his face that she'd started to recognize as his version of wanting to help and not being able to. On the second afternoon, he said, "The east corner needs more than what you've got there." "I know," she said. "I'm going to come back to it from the outside once the temperature comes up." "There's cedar shingle in the lean-to," he said. "Second stack from the left. Should be enough." "I'll find it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She stopped, looked at him. "The fitting on the left side," he said. "If you butt it that way, you'll get air through the joint when it shifts. You need to overlap it the other way and pin it high." She looked at what she was doing. She looked at the way he was describing. She pulled the piece out and refitted it. "Like that?" she said. He looked at it. "Yes," he said. She kept working. Dill, behind her, had gone very still in the particular way of a young man who had just watched something unexpected and was deciding what to make of it. "Don't say anything," Eliza told him quietly. "I wasn't going to," he said. And then after a pause, "He's never told Pete how to do anything. Pete just does it right the first time." "Then he's never needed to," she said. "Hand me the next piece." It was on the 5th day after the storm that Brock Talley came back. Eliza saw him coming from the window, the horse picking its way through the remnant drifts on the trail, Brock's broad shape in his coat, moving with the particular impatience of a man who doesn't like having been inconvenienced by weather. She watched him come through the gate, and something in the way he sat on that horse told her this wasn't a social call. She put the kettle on and went back to what she was doing and let Calder handle the door. The two men settled at the table. Eliza was at the stove, visible, not hidden, working on the bread she'd started an hour ago. She didn't leave the room. Brock glanced at her once and then arranged his attention on Calder. "Hell of a storm," Brock said. "Worst in a while," Calder agreed. "Lost 6 head, Brock said. Hay situation went bad in the second day. Storage got wet. Whole middle section went." A silence. Eliza worked the bread dough and did not look up. "Sorry to hear it," Calder said. "How'd you come out?" "Fine," Calder said. "Hay held. Animals are all right. Calf born premature in the middle of it, still alive." Another silence, this one with a different quality. "How'd the hay hold?" Brock said. "I thought your east storage had been a problem for years." "We rebuilt the floor in October," Calder said. "Fixed the drainage." Brock was quiet for a moment. Eliza could feel him working through this. The arithmetic of it, what it meant that Raven Creek had come through the storm that had cost him 6 head. She understood that it wasn't just the animals that were on his mind. It was the calculation men like Brock were always running. Who's ahead? Who's behind? What does that mean for the arrangement of things? "Your cook's idea?" Brock said. The word cook again, doing the same work it had done last time. "It was a conversation," Calder said. Brock shifted in his chair. "Well, the reason I came..." He paused, and this pause had preparation in it, the pause of someone who has been rehearsing. "There's a man named Victor Hale who's been buying up land in the valley. You may have heard of him." "I've heard the name," Calder said. "He was in Birch Hollow before the storm. He's been making offers. Reasonable ones. Not stealing exactly, but he knows who's in a difficult position." Brock said this without apparent discomfort, which told Eliza something about how Brock understood the situation. "After the hay loss, I'm going to have a conversation with him." "You're selling?" Calder said. "I'm having a conversation," Brock said. "There's a difference. But I wanted to let you know because he's going to come to you next. He had your place on his list before the storm. He had a number ready." Eliza's hands went still on the bread for exactly 1 second. Then she kept working. "I'm not selling," Calder said. "Calder." Brock's voice shifted into something almost gentle, which was more alarming than his ordinary tone. "I know how the last few years have been. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Hale's number isn't insulting. With the storm damage, with what you've been carrying..." "I'm not selling," Calder said again. Flat. No giving it. Brock was quiet. Then, "He'll come anyway. Thought you should hear it from me first." "I appreciate that," Calder said, in a way that indicated he appreciated it approximately as much as he appreciated the storm. Brock left 20 minutes later. Eliza waited until she heard his horse moving back down the trail, and then she turned from the stove. Calder was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance. He had the look of a man holding something in place by force of will. "Victor Hale," she said. "Land buyer," Calder said. "Been working the valley for 2 years. Bought 4 spreads that I know of. Waits until people are in trouble and then shows up with papers. Brock's going to sell." Sounds like it. Eliza thought about this, about what it meant for Raven Creek to be bordered by land that belonged to a buyer rather than a neighbor, a buyer who had 4 parcels already and was looking for more. "If Brock sells to him," she said carefully, "Hale owns the east boundary." Calder's jaw tightened. "Yes. And the water access on the East Creek branch runs through Brock's land." A pause. "Yes," he said again, quieter. She'd looked at the maps on Calder's table enough times in the last 2 months to know the shape of the land, where Raven Creek's access points were, which of them depended on the goodwill and cooperation of a neighbor versus which were unambiguously Calder's own. The East Creek branch was not unambiguously Calder's own. It was the kind of water access that had worked fine for 8 years, because Brock Talley was a difficult man but a known one, a neighbor with the specific understanding that neighbors develop over time. You don't interfere with someone's water in a place where water means everything, because your water is equally reachable if the relationship sours. Victor Hale would not be bound by that understanding. "When will he come?" she asked. "Soon," Calder said. "After the storm." Men like Hale let the weather do their negotiating for them. She went back to the bread. She worked it through and let the silence be what it was. "Calder," she said eventually. "I know," he said. The water access. "I know," he said again, sharper this time. Then, after a moment, "I know. I've known for 8 years, and I told myself it was fine because Brock was a reasonable man about water." He pushed back from the table slightly. "It wasn't a problem until it was going to be a problem." She didn't say anything to that. He was right, and saying so wouldn't help. "I need to know what the ranch is actually worth," she said instead. "Not what Hale will offer, what it's worth. With the improvements, with the hay situation resolved, with the winter it's just come through." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because when he comes, you should know the number before he tells you his." Victor Hale arrived on a clear Tuesday morning 9 days after the storm, and he was nothing like what Eliza had pictured and everything like what she should have expected. She'd pictured someone who looked like a predator, someone with the obvious edges of a man who made his living from other people's difficulties. What arrived instead was a compact, well-dressed man in his early 50s with a calm face and a quality of patient attention that seemed, on its surface, almost kind. He rode a good horse. He wore clean clothes despite the trail conditions. He had the manner of someone who had done this many times and had learned that the most effective version of what he did looked nothing like what it was. He introduced himself at the door with a firm handshake and a measured smile, and called Calder by his first name as though they were old acquaintances, which they were not. Eliza brought coffee. She didn't leave. Hale glanced at her once, a quick, assessing look that took in more than it appeared to, and then arranged his attention on Calder with the focused courtesy of a man who has decided not to make an issue of something. "I'll get to the point," Hale said, which was the kind of thing that men said when they intended to take some time getting to the point. "You've had a hard few years. Last winter was rough. This winter started rough. I've been buying land in this valley because I believe in its future, and I make fair offers. I think Raven Creek Ranch is a good property, and I'd like to discuss what a fair offer looks like." "I'm not selling," Calder said. Hale nodded slowly, as though this was a position he'd expected and had already incorporated into his planning. "I understand that's where you are right now. I'm not here to pressure you. I just want to put a number on the table so you have it." He named the number. Eliza was standing at the stove, and she heard the number and ran it against what she'd worked out over the past 9 days. The careful accounting she'd done from the documents on Calder's table, the ledgers he'd stopped updating 2 years ago. The land assessments in the county records Dill had ridden to Birch Hollow to fetch for her on a day when the trail was clear enough. The number was low. Not insulting, as Brock had said. Not the number you'd pay for a ranch that had come through the worst storm in years with all its animals alive and its hay dry and its infrastructure intact. It was the number you'd pay for a ranch in the condition Raven Creek had been in before October, before the drainage and the hay floor and the chimney and the fence line and the insulation work. Hale didn't know what had been done here. He'd based his number on what the ranch had looked like from the outside, which was how you based a number when you hadn't been inside it, when you were working from reputation and from the general run of things. "That number is from before the winter," Eliza said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice even. "The hay storage was rebuilt in October. The east drainage was corrected. The fence line was repaired. The barn roof is being repaired now. The ranch came through a major storm with no livestock losses and dry feed." She looked at Hale directly. "Your number doesn't reflect those improvements or the season this ranch just had." Hale's expression didn't change much. A slight recalibration behind the eyes. "You are?" he said politely. "She manages the ranch," Calder said. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say. She kept her face even. "The position I manage from is the kitchen," she said. "But the accounting isn't wrong." She pulled the papers she'd worked on and set them on the table between Hale and Calder, facing Hale. The numbers were laid out simply. What had been spent, what had been improved, what the corrected operating position of the ranch was compared to 12 months prior. If you're making a fair offer, it should be based on what the ranch is, not what it was. Hale looked at the papers. He looked at them for long enough that she knew he was actually reading them, not performing a reading. His expression shifted into something more genuine. Not the managed cordiality of before, but the specific look of a man who has encountered something he didn't expect. "You prepared this?" he said. "Yes." "You're a cook," he said. Not dismissively, more like someone checking a fact. "I cook," she said. I also do accounting. He looked at Calder. She's right, he said. If these numbers are accurate, my offer is undervalued. They're accurate, Calder said. Hale sat back slightly. He looked at the papers again. He looked at the room, at the fire burning clean in a chimney that was drawing properly, at the walls that held the cold out, at the table with Calder's maps and records laid out with more organization than they'd had when Eliza arrived. He was doing what she'd done when she first walked onto this property, reading the story that the physical space told. You've turned this place around, he said. Not to Calder, to Eliza. The ranch was always capable of it, she said. It needed consistent attention. Hale was quiet for a moment. I'm going to revise my offer, he said. I'd like to come back in a week with a corrected number. You can come back, Calder said. But I want to be clear. I'm not selling at any number. This ranch is not for sale. Hale looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard this many times and knows that circumstances are the ultimate negotiator. I understand, he said. I'll come back anyway. That's your right, Calder said. Hale left with the papers Eliza had prepared. She'd offered them to him because she wanted him to have accurate information, and she wanted him to know that Calder Hayes was not negotiating from ignorance. He took them, which told her he was a man who respected useful information regardless of its source. When the sound of his horse had faded down the trail, Calder sat at the table without moving for a while. Eliza poured him more coffee and sat down across from him, which was something she hadn't done before. Sat at his table as though she had a right to be there. He didn't say anything about it. He'll come back, she said. Yes. With a higher number. Yes. He looked at the space where the papers had been. And I'll still say no. I know, she said. But the higher number matters anyway. It tells the county what this land is worth. It tells anyone else who might want to make an offer what the floor is. She folded her hands on the table. And it matters to what happens with Brock's land. If Hale pays Brock a fair price because he knows we've got accurate numbers on our side, it's different than if he steals it. Calder looked at her. You think Brock will thank you for that? No, she said. But Brock's land is your eastern boundary, and his water is connected to your water, and what happens there matters to this ranch regardless of whether Brock thanks anyone. He was quiet. The fire worked in the hearth. Thomas came through the kitchen on some errand of his own and went back out without saying anything, with the learned instinct of a child who knows when adults are in the middle of something important. The East Creek branch, Calder said. Yes. If Hale controls that land and decides to be difficult about the water access, then we need documentation of the access rights before that happens, she said. Not after. He looked at her. Do we have documentation? I found 2 references to it in the county records Dill brought back. Both reference a long-standing easement, but neither one is formalized. She paused. You need a lawyer to look at it before Brock signs anything. Another silence. Calder pressed his thumb against the table's edge, an unconscious movement she'd noticed him make when he was working something through. There's a lawyer in Helena, he said. I've used him once, years ago. Can you write to him this week? I can ride to Helena, he said, when my leg allows. Write to him this week, she said again. You don't have to wait for your leg. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not softening, because Calder Hayes didn't soften, but a kind of relenting. The look of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for long enough that being told he doesn't have to feels both relieving and unsettling. All right, he said. He wrote the letter that evening. She noticed he sat at the table longer than usual working it, which meant he was being careful with what he said, and she left him to it and went to put the children to bed. The weeks after the storm had a different quality than the weeks before it. Something had shifted in the way Raven Creek moved, not in any single dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small things that change when trust has been established by events rather than by choice. Gus brought her questions now. Small practical ones about the animals, about the feed rotation, about what she'd noticed in the weather signs, and what she thought it meant. He didn't frame them as requests for her opinion. He framed them as operational checks, the way you'd check with anyone who had information you needed. But they were questions, and he was asking her, and 6 weeks ago, he'd been making comments about women on rooftops. Pete had started including her in the morning assessment of the day's work. Not formally, not sitting down and briefing her the way he'd brief Calder, but a sentence or two at the start of the day about what was being done and what he was watching. She recognized it as the way Pete communicated with people he considered part of the operation, and she accepted it as such. Dill had started asking Thomas to help with the afternoon work in the barn, which was partly genuine because Thomas was genuinely useful, and partly the specific generosity of a young man who has been treated kindly and wants to pass it somewhere. Thomas had developed a particular focus around the calf, which Dill had noticed and exploited in the way that easy-natured people exploit willingness, by giving Thomas more responsibility for it, which Thomas accepted with the solemnity of someone who understands what the responsibility means. The calf had a name by the third week after the storm. Clara had named it when nobody was paying attention, apparently in consultation with nobody, and the name was Button, and by the time anyone thought to question it, the name had already stuck. Calder, when he heard the name, had looked at Clara with an expression Eliza hadn't seen on his face before. Something between surprise and amusement, the expression of someone encountering an unexpected small thing in a life that had been largely without unexpected small things for some years. "Button," he said. "She has a button nose," Clara said with complete confidence. Calder looked at the calf. The calf did not obviously have a button nose. She had the nose of a calf, which was large and wet and constantly investigating things. "All right," Calder said. The lawyer's response came 2 weeks after Calder's letter. Eliza was at the table when Dill brought the mail in from his ride to Birch Hollow, and she saw Calder take the envelope and read it at his desk, and then set it down and look at the window for a long time. "What does he say?" she asked. "The easement is real," Calder said. "He's found the original filing, 1877. He paused. "He says it needs to be re-registered with the current county records to have full legal standing. He can do it, but he needs Calder to come to Helena." "When?" "Soon." Calder looked at his leg. "He says the next few weeks, before any land sale adjacent to the access point complicates the title search." Eliza thought about the trail to Helena, about the distance and the winter conditions, and what the ride would do to a leg that was only beginning to improve. "I'll drive you," she said. He looked at her. "I can handle a wagon in winter conditions," she said. "I did it in Illinois twice. It's not the same as Montana, but the principles are the same." "You'd leave the ranch." "Pete and Gus can manage the ranch for 3 days," she said. "They've been managing it between them for years. They don't need me here for 3 days." Calder was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Button was apparently doing something in the barn that made the calf's particular bleat audible even from the cabin, and Calder's mouth shifted in the way it did now when something amused him without quite becoming a smile. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "Since the letter from the lawyer," she said. "About 3 minutes after you read it." He looked at the window again, then at his leg, then at the letter. "We'd leave Thursday," he said. "Be back Saturday if the trail's clear." "Thursday is fine," she said. The trip to Helena took them 2 days each way because a section of the main trail had been damaged by the storm runoff, and they had to route around it, adding 4 hours to the journey, and the wagon had a tendency to pull left that Eliza compensated for through the first day and mentioned to Calder on the second, who adjusted the rigging at the next stop and looked at her sideways afterward. "You knew about that pulling before today," he said. "I didn't want to mention it while we were moving," she said. "You thought I'd take the reins." "I thought you'd want to," she said, which was different. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She kept her eyes on the trail. The lawyer was a small, precise man named Garrett, who worked from a cluttered office above a hardware store and had the specific energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed the work of untangling land records. He looked at what he had, asked Calder questions for an hour, asked Eliza questions for 20 minutes when he realized she'd been the one compiling the ranch's documentation, and then told them he could have the easement re-registered within the week. "You're lucky," Garrett said. "Another month and Tally's sale would have complicated this considerably. Once Hale's name is on that adjacent parcel, everything gets harder to move." "We know," Eliza said. Garrett looked at her over his spectacles. "You prepared the accounting documents she described to me in her letter?" He glanced at Calder. "The ones that revised Hale's original offer?" "Yes," she said. "Accurate work," he said. He said it the way a professional says something is accurate, without pleasure, purely as assessment. "You should have been a surveyor." "I've been told that before," she said, which wasn't true, but it seemed like the right thing to say. They ate dinner at a restaurant on Helena's Main Street that had tablecloths and a menu, and Calder sat across from her in a clean shirt he'd brought in his bag and looked slightly uncomfortable with the tablecloths and the menu in the way that men who've been alone on ranches for years tend to look in dining rooms, and Eliza felt a sudden and completely unexpected spike of something she hadn't felt in a long time. A lightness, a warmth unconnected to any practical consideration. She pressed it back down, ate her dinner, talked about the spring pasture rotation and what Pete had said about the north fence before they left. But it had been there, on the ride home, on the second day, when the trail had widened enough for them to ride more comfortably side by side. Calder said, without particular preamble, "Margaret would have liked you." Eliza kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I don't know that," she said. "I never met her." "I do," he said. "She had the same way of looking at things, like she was reading a language everyone else had forgotten." Eliza thought about the small leather book, about the list of drainage patterns and weather readings and observations about which animals behaved which way before which kind of weather, about the entry in Margaret's final recorded winter that read, "The east drainage will become a serious problem. I have told him 3 times. I will tell him again in the spring." "She sounds like she was patient," Eliza said. "She was," Calder said. "More patient than I deserved, probably." A bird crossed the trail ahead of them, low and fast, and was gone. "I found her journal behind the chimney stones," Eliza said. "The first week." "I know," he said. "Where did you think it came from?" She looked at him. "I thought it fell in." "She put it there," he said, "after she got sick. She said she was putting it somewhere safe." He was quiet. "I looked for it after she was gone. Couldn't find it." Eliza thought about that. About a woman who had spent 20 years watching a piece of land and had put her understanding of it somewhere she believed would last, somewhere the land itself would keep. "It found the right person eventually," she said. Calder didn't answer, but the way he held the reins shifted, something loosening in his shoulders that she'd been watching be tight since October. They got back to Raven Creek on a Saturday afternoon, and the smoke from the chimney was going straight up in the cold, clear air, and Pete met them at the gate and said Button had learned to run, and Clara came out of the cabin door at a speed that suggested she'd been watching the trail for some time, and Thomas came around from the barn with his coat on sideways because he'd put it on in a hurry, and Eliza sat on the wagon seat and looked at all of it and felt the thing she'd been holding back since August finally give way, a slow and quiet release, like a fist unclenching. Inside the cabin, Hale's revised offer was waiting on the table. Dill had picked it up from Birch Hollow 2 days earlier. The number was significantly higher than the first one. Calder read it standing up, still in his coat. Then he set it down. "Still no," he said. "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her. "You're not surprised." "No," she said, "but the number matters. For the reasons we talked about." He nodded slowly, looked at the letter again. "Write him back for me," he said. "Tell him the ranch is not available at any price, and tell him we've registered the easement on the East Creek access, and tell him—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Just those 2 things." "Just those 2, she said. She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table while Calder sat by the fire with Clara in the armchair beside him, reading to her from a book he'd found somewhere, his voice low and even, the particular voice of a man who hadn't read aloud to a child in a very long time and was finding it less awkward than he'd expected. Thomas was asleep in his room. Button was in the barn with Martha. The chimney drew clean. The north wall held its temperature. The hay in the east storage was dry and sufficient. Eliza finished the letter and set it aside to send with Dill in the morning. And she looked at the fire and the man reading by it and the child listening. And she thought about the road she'd walked in August, the ones that had turned her away, the one that had led here. And she did not try to make the feeling into anything larger than what it was. It was enough. Tonight, it was enough. Hale's letter went out with Dill on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday the reply had come back. Not from Hale himself, but from a representative, a younger man named Aldous, who arrived at the gate on a horse that was too good for the message he was carrying, which was simply that Mr. Hale respected the decision and wished Raven Creek Ranch well in the coming season. Eliza read the letter twice. Then she handed it to Calder. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," she said. He set it down. He didn't look relieved exactly, more like a man who has been bracing for a blow and felt it land softer than expected and isn't sure yet whether to trust that. Men like Hale don't walk away, he said. No, she agreed, but they recalculate. The easement changed his arithmetic. If the water access is legally documented and registered, the adjacent land is worth less to him than it was before. Brock's parcel becomes less strategic. She poured coffee and set it in front of him. He hasn't gone away. He's just found a different calculation to run. Calder looked at the letter. You think he'll come back? In a few years, maybe, when there's a different situation to exploit. She sat down across from him, which had become a thing she did now without thinking about it, the way you stop noticing a door that you use every day. But not this season. And by the next season, the ranch will be in better shape than it was in this one. He was quiet for a moment. That assumes you're still here, he said. The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Neither of them moved. Eliza looked at her coffee. She thought about August, about the road out of Dunmore with Clara's hand in hers and Thomas up ahead with the cart, about the woman at the trading post in Birch Hollow who described Raven Creek as a place nobody went, with the emphasis of someone delivering a warning rather than an invitation. I haven't thought about leaving, she said, which was true. She'd been too busy for most of it, and when she wasn't busy, she'd been too tired, and somewhere in between the chimney and the calving and the trip to Helena, the question of whether she was staying or going had simply stopped being a question she asked herself. I'd like you to stay, Calder said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation, looking at the table rather than at her. Not just as a cook. She looked at him then. I was still looking at the table. What are you saying? She said. I'm saying the ranch needs someone who understands it, he said. And I think... He stopped, started again. I think Margaret put that journal in the chimney because she knew someone would find it eventually who could use it. I don't know that. I can't know that. But it's what I think. He looked up. I think she would have called that arrangement sensible. Eliza understood what he was offering and what he wasn't. He wasn't offering romance. He wasn't offering the soft version of this story. He was offering a partnership, the practical, hardworking, eyes-open kind that people on the frontier made when they understood what survival actually required and had enough respect for each other to be honest about it. She thought about Frank, about what they'd had, which had been real and had been warm and was gone, and about the specific dishonesty of comparing what you've lost to what's in front of you, as though life owed you only one shape of good thing. I'd want the children to have security, she said, not just employment. If something happened to me, I'd need to know they were provided for. That's fair, he said. We'd draw it up properly. Garrett can handle it. And I want to keep the journal, she said. Margaret's record. I want to keep adding to it. He blinked. Something shifted in his face. You've been adding to it? In pencil, she said. In the margins. I can stop? No, he said. Don't stop. He looked away toward the window. She'd want it continued. That's why she kept it. To continue. Eliza nodded. Then we're agreed, she said. We're agreed, he said. Neither of them said anything more about it that morning. He went out to check the fence line on the south pasture, and she started bread, and the ordinary morning continued in its ordinary way, which seemed, on balance, exactly right. The large things in life rarely deserved more ceremony than that. A decision made at a kitchen table over coffee, two people looking at each other honestly and finding that what they saw was enough to build on. Brock Talley came by the following week. Not on a good horse this time, on the roan he used for working, a practical animal that matched the mood he arrived in, which was the mood of a man who has made a decision and has come to terms with it and is no longer comfortable with the terms. He sold to Hale. He told Calder directly, standing in the yard, not coming in for coffee. The papers had been signed in Birch Hollow 2 days ago. The price was reasonable. Hale had been fair. I know you think I should have held on, Brock said. It's your land, Calder said. The hay loss was too much. After the storm, I was looking at a year of rebuilding with no cushion if anything else went wrong. He said it without apology, because it wasn't an apology. It was an explanation, and there was a difference. I couldn't carry the risk. I understand that, Calder said. Brock looked at the cabin. His eyes moved to where Eliza was visible through the window, moving in the kitchen. She the one who prepared the documents for your lawyer? He said. She helped. Hale told me about them, Brock said. Said he hadn't expected that level of documentation from Raven Creek. A pause. Said whoever put those numbers together knew what they were doing. She does, Calder said simply. Brock looked at the ground and back up. He was a man working towards something and taking his time getting there. I laughed at her, he said. When I heard she was fixing the chimney, I made comments. I know, Calder said. I had 11 head going into that storm, Brock said. I came out with 5. He let that sit for a moment. She lost none. He left after that, riding back east toward land that was no longer his, and Calder came inside and sat at his table, and Eliza set lunch in front of him and didn't ask what they'd talked about because she'd heard most of it from the kitchen anyway. What she thought about, after Brock rode away, was this. The people who had laughed hadn't been stupid, exactly. They'd been operating on a set of assumptions about what a woman with a handcart and 2 children could do, and those assumptions had come from experience, from years of watching how the world generally worked, who generally held what knowledge, who generally had the capacity to do what kinds of things. The assumptions were wrong, but they hadn't come from nowhere. What changed assumptions wasn't argument. She'd known that since long before Montana. Argument gave people something to push against. What changed assumptions was outcome. Was 5 head and 11 head? Was dry hay and wet hay? Was a chimney that drew clean and a cabin that held heat and a calf born in a blizzard that was still alive and learning to run? You didn't change minds by telling people they were wrong. You changed them by making the truth visible enough that looking away from it required more effort than accepting it. That was the thing she'd learned from Frank's basement floods. The 3 springs she'd told him the grading was wrong, and he'd heard her and agreed and not fixed it, and the spring she'd poured a bucket of water along the foundation in front of him, and they'd both watched it flow toward the house. After that, he'd fixed it in 2 days. People need to see the water move. January finished itself, and February arrived. And February in Montana that year was what Margaret's records had said bad Februaries were. Cold that was not dramatic but was relentless, the kind that accumulates rather than strikes, grinding down whatever wasn't built to last. Eliza had been preparing for it since October, and the preparation held, but it was tested in the way that all preparations are eventually tested, usually in the specific spot you were least confident about. The north wall. The work she'd done on it before the December storm had been adequate but not finished. She'd said so at the time, had told Calder that she'd need to come back to it from the outside when the temperature came up. The temperature hadn't come up, not really, not enough. And in the sustained cold of February, the north wall began losing the battle it had been fighting since the fall. It didn't fail dramatically. What happened was subtler, a persistent cold near the northeast corner of the cabin that increased gradually over the second week of February until Thomas, who slept nearest to it, started waking up in the night. Eliza put him in with Clara and moved her own cot to his spot and confirmed what she'd suspected by lying in that cold for 20 minutes at 2 in the morning, feeling where it came from. The corner seam, where the north wall met the east wall. The cedar shingle work she'd done from inside had held everywhere except there, where the geometry of the corner made a cold trap that worked against everything she'd put in. She told Calder at breakfast. He looked at her. How bad? Not urgent, she said, but it needs to be done right, and it needs to be done from outside, and it needs the right materials. She'd been thinking about it since 2 in the morning. The cedar shingle in the lean-to isn't going to be enough for the corner geometry. I need something I can shape and fit and seal. Helena has it, he said. Lumber yard on the south end of town. We can't make that trip until the temperature comes up, she said. No, he agreed. So the interim solution is an interior barrier at the corner. Heavy wool, something that can hold air. I can do it today. It'll hold until we can make the trip. I have a trunk, he said. Back bedroom. Old wool coats. Margaret's, mine from years back. I don't use them. May I? He nodded and went back to his coffee. She found the trunk and opened it, and the smell of cedar and old wool came up, the smell of careful storage, things put away with the intention of lasting. She took out 2 heavy coats and a folded wool blanket that was the dense, tight-woven kind, and she spent the morning fitting them against the northeast corner in layers, pinning them to the wall structure with the nails Dill found in the workshop, creating a barrier that wasn't elegant but was effective. When she was done, she stood back and looked at it. It was not what you'd call finished work. It was a corner of an old cabin with coats nailed to it. It was the best available solution under the available conditions, which was, she had come to understand, the definition of most of what life on this frontier required. Not the perfect solution. The solution that worked with what you had. Calder stood in the doorway looking at it. "It'll hold," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see it'll hold." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew from the way he was looking at the coats that he was seeing something she couldn't. The coats specifically, what they were. She'd thought about that before she used them, and had decided he would have told her not to if he hadn't wanted her to. He'd offered the trunk knowing what was in it. "She had good coats," Eliza said. "She was particular about coats," he said. Said the difference between a good winter and a bad one was 50% about what you kept the heat in with. He looked at the corner a moment longer. She would have approved of the application. He went back to his work. Eliza stayed and looked at the corner and thought about Margaret Hayes and her records and her coats and her understanding of this specific piece of land, and she felt something she didn't have a word for exactly. Not grief, since she'd never known the woman, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of arriving somewhere important just after someone has left it, the warmth of their presence still in the walls. She picked up her tools and went back to the kitchen. Spring announced itself the way it always does in Montana, not with warmth exactly, but with the particular quality of cold that has begun to consider its retreat. The light changed first. February light was flat and direct, without depth. March light had layers to it, a suggestion of distance returning, of the world being larger than it had been for the past 3 months. The creek began moving under its ice. The horses started standing in the south corner of the paddock in the early afternoon, turning their faces to the sun with a specific and uncomplicated pleasure that Eliza had always found moving in animals. The directness of it, the lack of self-consciousness. They wanted warmth, and they stood in it, and that was the entire transaction. Button was 4 months old and approximately convinced of her own immortality, which expressed itself primarily in a habit of testing every gate and fence section in the barn with the focused curiosity of an engineer examining a structure for weaknesses. Thomas had appointed himself her primary handler, a role she tolerated with the ambivalence of a young animal who hasn't yet decided how she feels about human beings as a category. Clara had moved on from Button to the horses, specifically to a gray mare named Edith, who was old enough to be patient and young enough to still be interesting. Dill had started teaching Clara to brush Edith down in the afternoons, a development that Eliza had watched for a week before deciding it was fine, and that she should stop hovering over it. Letting children grow into things was its own kind of work. The hardest kind, maybe. The kind where your job was to do less, not more. She thought about that on a March afternoon while she was in the garden space behind the cabin, turning the ground over for the first time since the ground had agreed to be turnable. It was hard work. The soil was compacted and still cold 2 inches down, and the fork kept catching on rocks that had heaved up through the freeze and thaw cycle. But it was the right kind of hard work, the kind with visible results, the kind that left you physically tired and mentally clear. She heard Calder come up behind her and stop. "You're starting the garden," he said. "The ground's ready," she said, not stopping. "Barely, but ready." A pause. "Margaret's garden was here," he said. "The same spot." Eliza looked at the ground under her fork. She hadn't known that, and somehow it didn't surprise her. "I thought it was the right aspect," she said. "South-facing, protected from the north wind by the cabin wall." "Yes," Calder said. "That's why she picked it." She kept working. He stood there for a moment and then crouched down. His leg was better, significantly better, in the March air, and picked up a handful of the turned soil and looked at it the way farmers and ranchers look at soil, reading something in its texture and color that other people can't read. "Good," he said. "Set it down." She grew tomatoes and beans, and one year she tried corn, but it was too short a season. "I wasn't going to try corn," Eliza said. "Good," he said again. He stayed there while she worked, crouched down beside the garden space, not helping but not leaving either, and after a while he started talking about Margaret's garden, what she'd grown in which year, what the soil had needed, what the rabbits had taken, what she'd done about the rabbits. It wasn't a performance of memory. It was the way people talk about things they've been holding quietly for a long time, when they finally find a context in which to put them down. Eliza listened and kept working and didn't say much. This was another kind of work. The work of being the person someone can say things to. She'd done it for Thomas after Frank died, sitting with him in the evenings while he worked through the slow, uneven process of accepting what couldn't be changed. She hadn't had anyone to do it for her, and she'd made do. But she understood its value from the giving side, and she didn't underestimate it. When the afternoon light had shifted and the cold started coming back with the shadow of the cabin wall, Calder stood up and looked at what she'd turned over. "You'll need more manure mixed in," he said, "the east end especially." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask Pete about it tomorrow." "Pete will tell you to use the north pile," he said. "Use the south pile. It's been sitting longer." "I'll use the south pile," she said. He went back inside. She stayed a few minutes longer looking at the turned earth in the late March light, at the rough dark rows of it, and she thought about the season coming. Not just the garden, but the fence work that needed finishing, the barn roof section that Pete had repaired but that she wanted to re-inspect before summer, the creek bank erosion that was still on the list from October, the items she'd flagged and not yet gotten to. The list was never going to be empty. She understood that now in a way she hadn't in October, when she'd made the first list with the implicit belief that a list was a problem to be solved rather than a permanent condition of a living place. A ranch was not a problem you solved. It was a thing you maintained endlessly, with attention and patience and the willingness to be wrong about something and come back and fix it. That was what Margaret Hayes had known. That was what was in the record. Not a plan for perfection, but a practice of attention. Year after year of watching and noting and adjusting, the accumulated understanding of a woman who had committed to a piece of land completely enough to learn its language. Eliza put her fork over her shoulder and went inside. On the first genuinely warm day of April, warm meaning the temperature climbed above 40 before noon and stayed there. Warm meaning you could be outside without a coat for a few hours in the afternoon. The neighbors came. Not all at once. Not planned, as far as Eliza could tell. It was the kind of gathering that happens in small frontier communities when the winter finally releases its grip and people can move again, when the isolation of the cold months breaks and there's a natural human impulse to go see how everyone else came through. Two families she didn't know arrived in the morning from the north, a couple named Hargrove and a widow named Mrs. Fenner who drove her own wagon with the competence of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. A man named Clay from the spread to the west arrived on a horse in the early afternoon with two of his hands, and at mid-afternoon, unexpectedly, Brock Talley appeared at the gate, on foot this time, having apparently walked from the road where he'd left his horse, which Eliza chose not to read too much into. She cooked. She cooked the way her mother had taught her to cook for unexpected numbers, stretching what was there without making the stretching visible, making the table look generous while the math underneath was careful. By mid-afternoon, the main room was full of people and coffee and a pot of stew that was going to require a second pot before the afternoon was done. She heard them talking about the winter, about who had lost what, about the December storm and the second storm in January that she'd weathered successfully enough that she'd almost forgotten to be frightened of it, about Brock's hay loss in the hard February. She heard Brock say, at some point, Raven Creek came through clean, no losses. And she heard the quality of the silence that followed. Not disbelief, but the specific attention of people who are revising their understanding of something. Mrs. Fenner found Eliza in the kitchen around 4 o'clock, having apparently navigated there with the specific intention of finding her. She was a small woman, probably 70, with white hair and hands that showed every year she'd been in Montana, and eyes that showed she'd made peace with most of them. She looked at Eliza directly, the way old women look at people they're assessing. Not unkindly, but completely. "You're the one who fixed the chimney," she said. "Yes," Eliza said, "and the hay situation." "That was a group effort," Eliza said. "Pete and Gus and Calder did the physical work." "But you saw it," Mrs. Fenner said. "Yes." The old woman looked around the kitchen, at the organized pantry, at the pots on the stove, at the way the room functioned as a working space rather than just a room with a stove in it. "I came with my husband in 1859, she said. "He died in 1871. I've been running my spread alone since then." She said it without particular pride or complaint, just fact. "In 1871, there was nobody who thought I could do it. Not one person who thought I'd last the first winter without him." "But you did," Eliza said. "I did." She picked up a spoon from the counter, looked at it, set it back down. You know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the work. I knew how to work. The hardest part was the amount of energy I had to spend convincing people I knew how to work, instead of just using that energy for the work itself. Eliza looked at her. It gets easier, Mrs. Fenner said, not because people change, because you stop waiting for them to. She went back to the main room. Eliza stood at the stove and thought about that for a moment, and then she stirred the stew and went back to work. Later, when the afternoon had gotten long and the visitors were beginning to think about their return trips, Calder came into the kitchen. He had the look of a man who has been social for longer than is his natural preference and is approaching his limit. "Brock wants to talk to you," he said. "To me?" she said. "Apparently." He picked up a biscuit from the cooling rack without asking, which was something he'd started doing sometime in February and she'd stopped minding sometime in March. "He's outside." She went out. Brock was standing near the garden space she'd turned over, looking at it with his hands in his pockets, and he turned when he heard her come out. He'd lost weight since the storm. The winter had taken something out of him, not just the cattle, but a certainty she'd seen in him in November, a particular kind of confidence that men carry when things have been going roughly their way for long enough. It was a more honest face without it, though she suspected he wouldn't have chosen honesty at that price. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "I said things," he said. "When I came in November. About how a ranch runs. About what belongs where. I wasn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I was wrong. Not just about the hay and the winter. I was wrong about the rest of it." "All right," she said. He looked at her. He'd clearly been expecting more than that. Acceptance, maybe, or a gracious acknowledgement of his acknowledgement. She didn't have much interest in performing forgiveness for his benefit. "The water access," he said. "The easement. Hale told me you'd filed it before I sold." "Calder filed it," she said, "with your help." He looked at the garden. "If that easement hadn't been in place, Hale could have made your water situation very uncomfortable. I didn't—" He shook his head. "I didn't think about that when I sold. I didn't think about what it meant for your eastern access." "Hale knew," she said. "That's why he sent Aldous with the goodwill letter instead of coming back himself. The easement changed what my land adjacent to his was worth as a leverage point." Brock was quiet. "You figured all of that out," he said. "It's not complicated," she said. "It's just property law and geography." "It is complicated," he said, with something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Most people who can do it have law degrees." She shrugged. "I have a journal and time." He looked at her for a long moment. "I had a good 8 years with that land," he said. "Good water, good grass, mostly good winters. I wasn't prepared for a bad one." He scuffed the ground with his boot. "What you did here, preparing in October when it was still fall, when there was no emergency to respond to. That's not how most people think." "No," she agreed. "How do you think like that?" She considered the question. It was more honest than she'd expected from him, and it deserved an honest answer. "My father used to say that a problem is loudest right before it arrives," she said. "That the best time to fix something is when it's quiet and nothing is forcing you to. Because when something forces you to, you're already paying a penalty." She looked at the garden. "I've watched enough things be ignored into emergencies that I'd rather just fix them early." He nodded slowly. "Margaret Hayes thought that way," he said. "I remember her telling me something like that years ago. I thought she was being, I don't know, I thought she was being particular." "She was right," Eliza said. "She was right," Brock said. He left not long after. Eliza stood in the yard and watched him go and felt the cool April air on her face and thought about what Mrs. Fenner had said in the kitchen, about the energy spent convincing people versus the energy spent doing the work. About the point at which the convincing became unnecessary because the work had done it already. She thought they were close to that point, not past it. These things didn't have a finish line you crossed, and then never had to run again. But close to it. Well, Garrett sent the final registered documents for the easement in April, and Eliza made a copy of them in her own hand and added them to Margaret's record at the back, noting the date and the nature of the filing and what it protected. Then she added an entry of her own, her first full entry. Not a marginal note, but a proper entry in the record, in the space after Margaret's last one. She wrote the date, April 14th, 1895. She wrote, Winter of 1894 to 95. Worst storm, December 14th. All livestock survived. Hay storage held. Dry floor. South pile rotation. Chimney clear. Calf born premature December 14th. Now 4 months. Healthy. Easement on East Creek access re-registered with county. Full legal standing. North wall requires exterior work this spring before next winter. Cedar shingle. Northeast corner geometry. Creek bank erosion on north pasture edge requires attention before summer high water. East drainage running correctly. Continue to monitor in wet seasons. She paused and looked at what she'd written. It was practical. It was useful. It was the kind of entry Margaret would have written. Then she wrote one more line, which Margaret would not have written, because Margaret had been here and had not needed to write it for herself. This ranch is capable of surviving hard things. It requires attention, not miracles. The attention is the work. She closed the journal and put it back where she kept it now. Not behind chimney stones, but on the shelf in the small room that was no longer just a cold room that smelled like disuse. It was her room. It had been her room for 7 months, and it had changed the way rooms change when people live in them with intention. Calder proposed to her on a Tuesday in late April, which was so exactly like him, midweek, no ceremony, practical timing, that she almost laughed and managed not to. They were in the barn. He was checking Button's feet, which had recently become something of a project because Button had strong opinions about her feet being handled, and Eliza was watching from the gate with the specific attention of someone who has learned that the moment you stop watching is the moment something interesting happens. He stood up and turned to her and said, without particular preamble, "I want to make this formal. What we talked about in February. I want to do it properly." She looked at him. I was serious. Which was to say, he was exactly as he always was, because Calder Hayes was almost always serious. "You mean the partnership," she said. "I mean the marriage," he said, "and the partnership, both." She thought about Frank, about the life she'd had and the life she'd lost, about the road from Cedar Falls and the road from Dunmore and the road that had led here, about the way this man had given her a dead woman's journal and trusted her to add to it, about his leg in the cold, about the 2 mornings a week she brought his coffee before he asked for it, because she'd learned the schedule of his pain and had decided, at some point she couldn't precisely locate, that this was a thing worth doing. About her children, who had stopped carrying the fear she'd seen on their faces in August. About Thomas and his meticulous work and his calf. About Clara and Edith and Dill teaching her to ride with patient repetition. About the things you build when you show up somewhere broken and stay long enough to participate. "Yes," she said, "both." He nodded once, the way he received most information, neither over-dramatizing nor dismissing. He looked back at Button, who was using the moment of inattention to investigate the grain bin. "Button," he said sternly. Button turned and looked at him with the complete innocence of an animal that has been caught doing something and is buying time. Eliza laughed. Actually laughed, the full kind, not the contained kind she usually managed in situations where laughing felt like too much. It came out before she could think about whether it was appropriate, and it echoed in the barn, and Calder turned and looked at her with the expression he'd been developing since February, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was the direct ancestor of one. "She does that on purpose," Eliza said. "Obviously," he said, and went to redirect Button from the grain. They were married in June in Birch Hollow at the courthouse, with Pete and Gus and Dill as witnesses and Thomas standing next to Calder with his hands in his pockets and the solemn expression of someone taking a responsibility seriously, and Clara in a dress Eliza had made from fabric she'd bought in Helena, standing next to Eliza and holding her hand with the grip of a child who is both completely happy and unwilling to let go. Mrs. Fenner was there because Eliza had invited her and she had come, and she sat in the back of the small room and watched with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to know what it looks like when 2 people are doing the right thing. Brock Talley was not there, but he sent a note that Dill brought in on the morning of the ceremony, which said only, "Congratulations, Talley." And on the back, in smaller writing, the south pile was the right choice for manure. She would have done the same. Eliza read it twice and put it in her coat pocket and kept it there. The ceremony was short and direct, which suited both of them. Afterward, they ate at the restaurant with the tablecloths where she and Calder had eaten on the Helena trip, and Clara was overwhelmed by the menu in the specific way of children who have been given too many options. And Thomas ate his meal with quiet concentration and then ate what Clara couldn't finish. And Calder sat across from Eliza at the table with the white cloth and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since February, which was the way you look at something you've stopped being afraid of losing. On the drive back to Raven Creek, in the long June evening light that kept the sky bright until almost 9, the children fell asleep in the back of the wagon under a blanket, and the road was clear and dry, and the horse knew the way. Eliza held the reins and looked at the country opening ahead of them. The ridge where the first snow always came, clear and bare in the summer warmth, the tree line dark against the pale sky, the trail pulling toward the gate where she'd stood 7 months ago, with her handcart and her $12 and her 2 sleeping children and the smoke from a chimney going the wrong direction. The smoke would be right when they got home. She knew this the way she knew the lean of the fence post and the schedule of Calder's pane and which bales to use first. She knew it because she'd fixed it, and the things you fix with your own hands become part of you in a way that other knowledge doesn't. "You're thinking," Calder said. "Always," she said. "What about?" She considered what was true. About roads, she might have said. About what it costs to keep moving when the doors close. About the fact that survival is mostly attention, paying it when it's inconvenient, paying it when nobody sees you doing it, paying it when the weather says stop, and you pay it anyway. About the fact that home is not a place you find. It's a thing you make, with work and time, and the willingness to be present in the difficulty of it, to fix the chimney and lay the floor and be in the barn at 11 in the morning with cold hands and a lantern, and to keep doing those things after the crisis has passed because the ranch is alive, and living things require continuous attention, and that attention, paid consistently and honestly over time, is not a burden, it's a life. "Nothing much," she said. "Just the road." He nodded and looked ahead, and the wagon moved through the long Montana evening toward home.